State terror is defined as a state that generally perpetrates political violence upon its own population or also among another state's civilian population for the purpose of spreading fear and terror. Just as a side note, state terror is not the same as state-sponsored terrorism, which is where the state enables a terrorist group or other non-state actors to commit a terrorist attack, while state terror is the state directly committing acts of terror and violence. In this video, I'll give a few notable examples of state terror in the 20th and 21st centuries. There are a ton of examples, but these are just a few case studies as an introduction to state terror. First up is the Soviet Union in the pre-World War II era. The Soviet Union committed their first round of mass political purges, executions, and terror into the population right after the end of the Russian Civil War. Lenin used the Cheka, which was the early Soviet secret police, to perform mass arrests, imprisonment, torture, and executions without a trial in what became known as the Red Terror. It policed the Gulag system of labor camps, conducted requisitions of food, and put down rebellions by workers and peasants. The Cheka was responsible for executing at least 50,000 to as many as 200,000 people in a range of terror throughout the early 1920s, though estimates vary widely. The Red Terror was followed by the Great Purges by Joseph Stalin from 1936 to 1939, where Stalin used the NKVD to kill a further 700,000 to 1.2 million people in a mass terror over the Soviet Union. A second and quite obvious example of state terror is Nazi Germany. The Nazis committed a lot of state terrorism among their own population and against the states all around them that I'm pretty sure I don't really even need to talk about as much, but the state terror of the Nazis is so well known and it is very easy to find. Overall, the Nazis used state terror tactics as a means of political repression and terror bombings on direct civilian targets to spread fear among all neighboring states, as well as their own. The next case of state terror from World War II is Imperial Japan. The Japanese during the Second Sino-Japanese War and World War II unleashed one of the worst atrocities and examples of state terror in human history. From mass terror bombings of Chongqing, which lasted for almost 7 years, to the Nanjing Massacre and Japanese occupation of pretty much any territory that they came across in World War II. The Japanese state purposefully attacked and killed civilians in the most brutal ways imaginable, which I can't really talk about here on YouTube for age restriction reasons. But the main reason that it's classified as state terror is that the Japanese behavior was strongly mandated and even encouraged by the state. The Soviets during the post-World War II era saw Joseph Stalin and the Ministry of State Security continue their purges and rule by fear, which ended in de-Stalinization under Nikita Khrushchev in 1953, and then the thaw in the later early 1950s. But during the Cold War, the Soviets planned many sabotage operations within U.S. cities designed to terrorize the public. Some of these operations also included biological weapons attacks being planned for the 1980s in the U.S. as the Soviets believed that the Western powers were so unprepared for a biological war as the West followed through with anti-biological weapons agreements, which the Soviets did not. Argentina during the Argentine Dirty War from 1974 to 1983 is probably the most well-known case of state terrorism. During the Dirty War, left-wing insurgents and terrorist groups such as the Montoneros and ERP attacked both civilians and the government, which drew a massive over-response by Argentina. The Argentine regime was quite authoritarian, and security forces such as death squads in the form of the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance hunted down any political dissidents and anyone who was believed to be associated with socialism, left-wing Peronism, or the Montoneros movement. 22 to 30,000 people were estimated to have been disappeared by the regime in order to spread fear among the population. Next up we got Chile under Pinochet from 1973 to 1990, and it is also one of the most well-known case studies of state terrorism, with the Pinochet regime committing mass human rights violations and many disappearances of their own population. The Chilean government conducted mass torture and repression, which included the DINA and the Caravan of Death, which was a Chilean death squad operating on the state's behalf. In Operation Colombo, for example, the DINA abducted and disappeared 119 political opponents. There were many disappearances in Chile as a result of left-wing insurgencies, kind of like the Argentine Dirty War. The People's Republic of China has also been a massive perpetrator of state terrorism. In many different cases, such as Mao's reign and a lot of stuff that he did, the Cultural Revolution, stuff that's gone down in Tibet, and really a whole bunch of other stuff, so I'm only going to be talking about the Uyghur situation here in this video. In response to various radical Islamic attacks by Uyghur separatists, in May of 2014, the government of China launched the Strike Hard campaign against violent terrorism, which included the mass internment of the Uyghurs. The Xinjiang internment camps in northwestern China house over 1 million to 3 million people and about 500,000 people under the age of 18. Again, it's state terrorism because the Chinese state is wanting to install fear within the population by interning them and trying to forcefully convert them away from Islam into being PRC people. State terrorism deployed by the Syrian Ba'athist government has existed ever since its seizure of power through a violent coup in 1963. The Syrian Ba'athist government has since deployed various types of state terrorism, such as ethnic cleansing, forced deportations, massacres, summary executions, and many other forms of violence to maintain its totalitarian rule in Syria. The most extensive use of state terrorism by Syria was the state deploying extensive violence against civilians, such as the 2004 Qamishli massacre. Later on, when the Arab Spring spread to Syria in 2011, the Ba'athist security apparatus launched a brutal crackdown against peaceful protesters which killed thousands of civilians and deteriorated the crisis into a full-scale civil war. The Syrian civil war has also seen a lot of state terrorism, which has included the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons against civilians. There are a lot of other case studies and examples from these states that I didn't even really touch on, but this was just a brief introduction and summary of state terrorism. Did you know about state terror before this video? What other examples do you think I should have covered? Write in the comments, and thank you for watching.